1 week in the books for the fantasy football season. We got you ready here for week 2 on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Waiver wire, Stealthy starts, and the stream team here with our crew. And even if you lost in week 1, no need to worry. 6 NFL teams had fourth quarter comebacks in week 1, and we got your comeback ready here for week 2. Let's kick it off. My name is Steven Andrus, joined by 2 members of our Radio.com sports team, Jesse Pantusco and Jordan Cohn. As always, we kick off the show with Waiver Wire, and this year in particular, it carries big importance because we didn't have preseason to give us any clues on how teams were going to utilize some of their players. So get after it in week 2. Be aggressive. Get the guys that you need for your bench. And I'm going to start with the 2 biggest names at the running back position. Malcolm Brown of the Los Angeles Rams is my number 1 waiver wire ad for week 2. We didn't know how this Rams backfield was going to shake out entering the season, but Malcolm Brown in week 1 against Dallas, 18 carries, 3 receptions for 110 total yards and 2 touchdowns. Compare that to just 15 touches and 43 yards for the rookie Cam Akers. It seems pretty clear that Sean McVay trusts Malcolm Brown to get at least half of these touches in that backfield, and more importantly, trusts him near the goal line. My second waiver wire recommendation, can you name the only team on Sunday to not give carries to more than 1 running back? It was Jacksonville. James Robinson of the Jaguars was the only running back to get touches in that backfield. I should be more specific, the only running back to get carries in that backfield, 16 of them for 62 yards and 1 reception. Chris Thompson did add 2 targets out of that backfield, but in terms of carries, only wide receiver Laviska Shenault and quarterback Gardner Minshew saw backfield carries for Jacksonville. They like this undrafted rookie. In fact, the first undrafted rookie to start week 1 in 30 years. When you're getting that kind of volume, even though this is a team that might struggle for some of the season, that's a player that should be on fantasy benches to see what this kid can do. Jordan, you have another running back that popped, and it's a rookie.
Yeah, absolutely. I stayed on the running back train here. And among all the rookies, this was not one that people expected to blow up like he did. But I'm going to go with Josh Kelley of the Los Angeles Chargers. He had more rushes than guys like DeAndre Swift, Antonio Gibson, Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, guys who were drafted earlier and who figured to have bigger roles right off the bat. And again, this is a backfield that we didn't come into the season knowing exactly how it would play out. Justin Jackson suffered that hamstring injury, and it looked like Josh Kelley is the guy that's going to pick up that role behind Austin Eckler. And even if he is kind of that 1B to Eckler, Eckler is definitely the definitive primary back there. Jackson never had double-digit carries in any of his games backing up Eckler last year. Kelley did it in his NFL debut. So I think that this guy has a pretty high ceiling as a backup, a lot of handcuff value, and he can have some weekly play as well.
Yeah, I agree with that pick there by Jordan, especially if Joshua Kelley is going to end up getting goal line carries and Vulture Eckler there. Going to be definitely a guy you want to own. I'm going to switch it up and take us to the wide receiver position with Russell Gage from Atlanta, who was one of 3 Falcons yesterday to go over 100 yards receiving, finished with a really nice 9-114, 0 receiving line on 12 targets in that shootout against Seattle. We like volume in fantasy, and he seems like a pretty safe bet in that regard. Atlanta tends to be in a lot of shootouts. Last season, they threw the ball on a league high 67% of their plays. And yesterday it was an even higher percentage. It was 72%. Matt Ryan attempted 54 passes against Seattle. And I think this sets up pretty well for Russell Gage, who at the moment is only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. So he's available pretty much everywhere. In week 2, they're playing in another projected shootout against Dallas. I believe the over-under for that game is 50, which is the 4th highest Vegas game total of the week.
And no team vacated more targets coming into this season than the Atlanta Falcons. So that also another plus in the column for Russell Gage. Let's move on to the stream team. This is a category where we each pick a quarterback, a tight end, and a defense that are owned in less than 50% of leagues that we feel confident if we need to pick up and start him this week. And we'll kick it off with Jordan.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with the quarterback position here. And I'm going to go with a slightly contrarian pick who, last time I checked, was owned in about 40% of leagues. That number might go down after a pretty weak starting performance, and I'm going to go with Baker Mayfield here. The Bengals defense really isn't anything special. And again, this one might be slightly contrarian because he looked out of sync, he looked sloppy. But again, it's the Ravens defense. They're a fantastic defense, fantastic secondary. Nothing that the Bengals are going to be able to compare to. Trey Waynes is still going to be out and missing time. And even though he looked out of sync, Mayfield has pretty solid history against the Bengals. Week 17 last year, he only had 12 completions that went for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns. There's a lot of big playability here, and Hunter Henry was probably the best receiver for the Chargers against the Bengals yesterday. And tight ends is a position where Mayfield has shown some comfort before. Njoku had the touchdown yesterday. Hopefully he'll be able to play for week 2. If not, they still have Austin Hooper and Harrison Bryant.
I'm gonna go really off the board for my stream. I got tight ends, and I'm going with Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. A little bit of background on Logan Thomas. If you remember all the way back to 2014, he was a 4th-round pick out of Virginia Tech as a quarterback, and really kind of struggled in that role. Never really saw the field as a backup. Eventually, a few years ago, switched to tight end because he is enormous. He's 6'6", 250, a plus athlete, ran a 4.6 at his combine back in the day, and hasn't gotten a ton of run, but in Washington, he sort of finds himself as the number 1 tight end at the moment. One reason I think he's streamable this week, not even in season-long leagues, not just DFS, is because of the matchup. They're going to Arizona, and if you remember last season, no team in football allowed more receiving yards, 1,148, or touchdown 16, or fantasy points, 13, a little over 13 per game, to opposing tight ends last year than Arizona. That game is going to be played indoor at University of Phoenix Stadium. And clearly Logan Thomas is getting looks from Dwayne Haskins. So I think that is one to keep an eye on for streaming purposes this week.
Yeah, I don't know about Jeremy Sprinkle and Marcus Ball, but I would sprinkle in some Logan Thomas, and he should ball out. So they like their tight ends in Washington. So I like that option. I'm going to look at defenses here. The Chiefs defense going up against the Chargers on the road in LA in week 1 against Deshaun Watson. They had 4 sacks and an interception, an impressive debut for this defense. They're taking on the Chargers, who only scored 16 points in week 1 at Cincinnati, allowed a couple of sacks. And in fantasy, when you're talking about a defense that plays on a team with such a high-powered offense like the Patrick Mahomes offense, that's going to lead to their opponents having to play catch-up in the second half. That's going to lead to more passing down situations, more opportunities for sacks and turnovers. So I like the Chiefs. I think they're in a good spot here for their defense to capitalize off of this matchup in week number 2. All right, time for Stealthy Starts. These are players who have been started in less than 50% of leagues the previous week. Players that you may not have drafted to start, but have a good enough matchup in week 2 where we feel confident plugging them in to our starting lineup. Jesse, let's have you kick us off this category.
You said players rostered in under 50 or started in under 50% of leagues. Let me give you a guy who is rostered in only 43% of Yahoo leagues, and that number dwindles to 4% starting rate. We're talking about Allen Lazard, the number 2 receiver on Green Bay, coming off a surprising week 1 where he went for 4 catches, 63 yards, and a touchdown. I was just watching the highlights to that. Probably should have been 2 touchdowns. He got tripped up. He had Harrison Smith beat to the end zone and sort of had to come back for it and was stopped inside the 10-yard line. This week he is going against division rival Detroit. 2 of Allen Lazard's 3 touchdowns a year ago came against the Lions. That seemed to be the team he really excelled against. He averaged 67 yards against them last year compared to only 24.5 against the rest of the league. So a guy that's only started in 4% of Yahoo leagues, I keep an eye on him against Detroit in week 2.
Yeah, I like that pick of Lazard. I'm not going to go with someone who's as unowned and or unstarted, but I think that John Brown was someone who was kind of disrespected throughout fantasy drafts this year. His ADP had him in between 45 and 49 for receivers, depending on the website that you use. And I mean, he put up 1,000 yards a year ago. I think the Stephon Diggs acquisition scared people away from him, but I mean, you can see yesterday he has a great rapport with Josh Allen. His over-under yesterday for yards was at 44.5, which I also thought was disrespectful, and he had it easily in the first half. the game script didn't quite dictate that he would keep going up. But we'll see what happens against Miami in week 2, who I think is a little bit stronger of a competition than the Jets. I still think it's a game that the Bills will handle fairly easily. And last year against Miami, he had 83 yards and a touchdown the first time out, 137 yards and 2 touchdowns the last time out. He was also one of 11 receivers in week 1 to have double-digit targets. So even with Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen loves looking John Brown's way. He's a deep threat. One play can be enough for a viable fantasy week from him. So I love starting Brown, and he's probably going to be on most benches after the draft.
And we talked about it in the preseason, guys, with no preseason games, with this COVID era that we're in right now. Continuity matters. Chemistry matters between wide receivers and quarterbacks, and John Brown clearly has that with Josh Allen. I was going to pick Marlon Mack as my stealthy start this week. And then he unfortunately, had an Achilles injury. But it made my pivot really easy. So I'm going with another guy in that Colts backfield, Nyheim Hines. With Mack out of the picture, this goes from a 3-man backfield to a 2-man backfield. With Phillip Rivers at quarterback, with Frank Reich at head coach. This kind of reminds me of an Austin Eckler situation. Nyheim Hines is going to be the pass-catching back in this backfield, in a backfield where you have a head coach that doesn't like to give the vast majority of the touches to one running back, especially a rookie, even though it's a rookie as talented as Jonathan Taylor. But Hines in week 1 played 53% of the snaps. In a game, Marlon Mack still got 7 touches. I know the JT hype is real and it's going to go through the roof this week with this Mack injury, but Hines in week 1, 7 rushing attempts, 8 receptions on 8 targets, 73 total yards, and 2 touchdowns. They used him in the red zone, and it wasn't even both receiving touchdowns. He had a shotgun run from about 12 yards out that scored as well. So week 2 against Minnesota, the Vikings just allowed 158 yards rushing to Green Bay in week 1. I like Nyheim Hines not only for this week, but for many weeks to come here. I think there's a role for him, even though Jonathan Taylor is uber talented, with now it's looking like Marlon Mack is going to be out of the picture. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. For Jesse Pantusco, for Jordan Cohn, I'm Steven Andrus. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions this week, be sure to give us a comment here below, and we'll be happy to answer it as the week plays along. Good luck in week 2 and the rest of the season. We'll see you right back here next week.